What if the most important moment of your life already happened, and you didn't notice it? What if the choice that quietly redirected your entire existence felt ordinary only because you survived the version where it mattered most? Have you ever wondered why some moments echo longer than memory? Why certain seconds feel heavier than others? As if reality itself paused to watch what you would do. There is a strange discomfort in realizing that your life may not be a straight line, but a narrow corridor carved through countless unrealized possibilities. We grow up believing decisions are personal, contained, harmless, yes or no, left or right, stay or leave. But physics tells a colder, more unsettling story. At the deepest levels of reality, outcomes do not politely disappear. They persist, they coexist, they wait, and sometimes they interfere. Every choice you've ever made required the universe to do something extraordinary. It had to decide which version of you continues, not metaphorically, structurally. Somewhere beneath the surface of what you call now, probabilities collapsed, histories realigned, and entire futures were quietly abandoned. You didn't feel it because you were never meant to. Survival requires ignorance, yet every so often something leaks through. You feel it when you wake up with a sense of loss you can't explain, when you mourn something that never happened, when you replay a decision you barely remember making and wonder why your chest tightens as if you escaped something or failed to. These sensations are not poetic illusions. They are signals, residue, the emotional static left behind when multiple timelines brush too close to each other. Physics already allows this. In quantum mechanics, a system doesn't choose an outcome because it wants to. It chooses because interaction forces it to. Before measurement, particles exist as overlapping possibilities, each one real enough to influence the whole. Only when observation occurs does the system commit. And commitment, in physics, is violent. It erases alternatives not by destroying them, but by making them inaccessible. Now, imagine consciousness as part of that measurement. Imagine that every major decision is a kind of observation event, where your awareness locks reality into a specific configuration. The future doesn't unfold, it resolves. And resolution always leaves behind pressure, stress in the structure of existence, the kind that can bend back on itself. This is why certain choices feel heavier before you make them. Not because you're anxious, but because you are standing near a convergence point, a place where many possible lives overlap so tightly that the future feels crowded. Time thickens there, seconds stretch, your intuition screams, your body hesitates. Something in you knows that once you move, something else will never be able to follow. People often describe these moments as fate, or destiny, or intuition. But those words are too gentle. The truth is darker. You are not sensing guidance. You are sensing compression. Too many futures trying to pass through a single instant. And not all of them make it. Consider the moments you still think about years later. Not the dramatic ones, the small ones, the phone call you almost didn't answer, the road you didn't take, the sentence you chose not to say. Why do these moments glow in memory like radioactive fragments? Why do they feel unfinished? Because in some nearby version of reality, they weren't small at all. They were turning points. You can't remember those lives, but you can feel their absence. This is where the story becomes uncomfortable, because if timelines exist in parallel, they are not guaranteed to stay separate. Separation requires stability, energy, distance, and choices don't always create enough of either. Some decisions branch cleanly, others barely diverge at all. And when two timelines remain too similar, too close in structure, physics allows for something rare and dangerous: interference. Just as waves can overlap and amplify or cancel each other, closely aligned realities can bleed information across the boundary, not memories in the cinematic sense. Something more primitive, emotional tone, familiarity, a sense of having already lived this moment. This is why déjà vu feels wrong. Not magical, wrong, like recognition without context. Like your nervous system remembers something your mind is forbidden to access. You've felt this before, standing in a place you've never been, yet feeling homesick for it. Meeting someone who feels ancient to you, instantly familiar, unreasonably significant. Or sensing dread around a decision that logic insists is harmless. These are not coincidences. They are pressure points, places where timelines brush close enough to exchange shadows. And the closer you get to a life-changing choice, the stronger these effects become. Because major decisions don't just choose futures, they prune them. They force reality to simplify. And simplification always comes at a cost. The cost is paid in grief you don't understand, anxiety with no clear source, and the persistent feeling that something important is missing from your life, even when everything seems fine. This is why people who make drastic life changes often report a strange numbness afterward, not relief, not joy, a quiet emptiness, as if something vital was left behind. They'll say, "I got what I wanted, but I feel off." What they're feeling is not regret. It's the echo of collapsed futures, lives that were fully viable, now sealed away. Physics calls this decoherence. When a system interacts with its environment strongly enough, its alternate states stop communicating. They don't vanish. They just lose the ability to affect each other, until under rare conditions, that barrier weakens. And it does weaken. During stress, during exhaustion, during moments of extreme emotion, during sleep, during grief, during profound choice. That's when the mind becomes porous. That's when dreams feel like memories. That's when you grieve people you've never lost. That's when you feel pulled toward paths that make no rational sense. Something in you is responding to information you were never meant to consciously receive. You were taught that reality is stable, singular, reliable, but stability is expensive. It requires constant correction. And sometimes those corrections fail. Sometimes timelines drift. Sometimes they curve back toward each other. And sometimes they merge, not seamlessly, not cleanly. Merges leave scars, psychological ones, existential ones, the kind that make people feel displaced in their own lives, as if they are living a version of themselves that almost fits, but not quite, like wearing someone else's memories as a costume. This documentary is not about fantasy. It's about structure, about what must be true if physics is honest and consciousness is not an accident. It's about the uncomfortable possibility that your sense of self is the survivor of a filtering process you never agreed to, that your present life is not the best one, just the one that's stabilized. And now, as you listen to this, something subtle is happening. Awareness changes systems. Observation alters outcomes. By considering the possibility of branching and merging timelines, you are participating in one. You are approaching a decision point, not necessarily an external one, but an internal shift, a moment where your future configurations begin to rearrange around what you are willing to see. The question is not whether parallel timelines exist. The question is whether you can feel the ones pressing against this moment right now. Whether your restlessness, your curiosity, your quiet sense that something important is approaching is actually a warning. Because once you become aware of the fork, you can't unknow it. And the next choice you make may not just decide what happens next. It may decide which version of you gets to continue. If segment 1 cracked the surface, this is where we descend. Because once you accept that a single moment can fracture reality, the next question becomes unavoidable. What exactly breaks when a choice is made? We like to imagine the universe as clean and decisive. One cause, one effect, one life. But that picture only survives at human scale. When you shrink down to the level where reality is actually built, certainty dissolves. At that depth, the universe does not choose. It explores. Every outcome that can happen does happen, at least briefly. The question is not why multiple futures exist. The question is why you only experience one. In physics, there is a concept that unsettles even the scientists who work with it. A system evolves smoothly, mathematically, across all possible states. Nothing collapses until interaction forces it to. Not time, not probability, not identity. Collapse is not natural, it is imposed. And every imposition leaves strain. Think of a river splitting around a rock. Both streams are real. Both carry momentum, history, direction. Now imagine forcing one stream to vanish instantly. The water doesn't disappear politely. Pressure builds, turbulence forms. Eddies spin where flow was denied. Reality behaves the same way. Every decision you make is a forced collapse. Before the choice, your future is not empty. It is populated. Versions of you already exist mathematically, walking different streets, speaking different words, loving different people, surviving different endings. These versions are not imaginary. They are required by the equations that govern reality. They are valid solutions. And when you choose, you don't erase them. You disconnect from them. This is why choice feels exhausting when it truly matters. Your nervous system isn't tired because you're indecisive. It's tired because you're standing inside a region of high probability density. Too many futures are competing for continuity. Too many versions of you are viable. Physics has a name for this: tension. It's not poetic. It's called instability. Unstable systems don't break immediately. They oscillate, they flicker, they hesitate, and when consciousness is part of the system, as it is in any human decision, the instability feels like anxiety, dread, anticipation, or a strange sense that time is slowing down. Your body reacts before your thoughts do, because your body is closer to the machinery of reality than your stories are. This explains something people rarely talk about: why some decisions feel urgent even when there is no danger, why waiting feels unbearable, why procrastination feels like pressure rather than laziness. You are not avoiding the choice. You are delaying collapse. Your system is resisting the cost of pruning futures, because pruning is brutal. In the language of physics, when a system collapses into one state, the information describing the other states doesn't vanish. It becomes inaccessible, locked behind decoherence barriers. But information has mass, it has energy, and when it's cut off, it leaves an imprint, like amputating a limb that still sends pain signals. This is why regret doesn't behave like logic. You can make the right decision and still feel haunted. You can improve your life and feel inexplicably sad. You can escape danger and feel guilty for surviving. These are not moral failures, they are structural side effects. You didn't just choose a path, you terminated others, and termination leaves echoes. Now, here's where things grow more unsettling. Because not all collapses are clean. Some decisions don't push timelines far enough apart. The divergence angle is too small. The lives remain similar in structure, same city, same people, same general identity, differing only in subtle emotional or experiential ways. When that happens, the boundaries weaken. This is not science fiction. In wave mechanics, when two wave functions remain partially coherent, they can interfere. Peaks reinforce. Troughs cancel. Information bleeds. The system behaves unpredictably. Translate that into lived experience. You suddenly feel drawn towards something you can't justify. You experience a sense of familiarity that doesn't belong to memory. You make a choice that feels inevitable, even though you can't explain why. Or you avoid a path with visceral certainty, as if you already know how it ends. This is not destiny. It's interference. Your consciousness is not isolated from probability. It is embedded within it. And when nearby timelines remain close enough, emotional and intuitive signals can cross over, not as clear messages, as distortions, as mood, as intuition, as fear without a story. This is why intuition often feels irrational, because it is not coming from logic. It is coming from statistical pressure, from outcomes that almost became real, and the universe does not distinguish between almost and never. If a future was viable, it leaves a trace. Think about how often you felt like you were on the edge of something important. Not excitement, pressure. As if something was asking you to commit, to lock in, to stop floating between possibilities. Those moments are not psychological tricks. They are convergent zones. A convergent zone is where multiple timelines pass close enough that the system becomes unstable. The universe prefers stability. It will nudge events, subtly, toward resolution. Opportunities appear, accidents happen, conversations occur at exactly the wrong or right moment. You call it coincidence. Physics calls it minimization of uncertainty. The universe hates unresolved states. This is why life-changing decisions often arrive clustered. You don't face one choice. You face many, all at once. Relationships, careers, locations, identities. It feels overwhelming because the system is trying to reduce degrees of freedom. Too many futures are active. Reality is overloaded. And eventually, something gives. You decide. Or something decides for you. And here's the part no one prepares you for. When collapse happens, it doesn't feel like clarity. It feels like loss. Even when the outcome is good. Even when the choice was necessary. Because clarity requires forgetting. And forgetting takes time. In the immediate aftermath of a major decision, the mind is quiet, not because it's at peace, but because it's stunned. Futures went silent all at once. The noise stopped, the pressure vanished, and what's left feels eerily empty. People misinterpret this emptiness as failure. They think they chose wrong. But what they're feeling is the absence of multiplicity. They are no longer many. They are one. And being one is lonely. This is also why some people become addicted to indecision, to chaos, to constant change. They are unconsciously trying to stay near the branching point, where many futures remain open, where identity is fluid, where loss has not yet occurred. Commitment feels like death because, structurally, it is. Not physical death, existential death. The death of unrealized selves. And if this sounds dramatic, consider the alternative. If choices didn't eliminate futures, they would be meaningless. The weight you feel before a decision exists precisely because something real is at stake. Something that will not survive the moment you move forward. But the story doesn't end with collapse, because reality is not static. Timelines drift. Conditions change. Barriers weaken. And under certain circumstances, stress, grief, exhaustion, deep emotion, the walls between nearby realities thin. This is when people feel disoriented, when they say, "I don't feel like myself anymore," or "This doesn't feel like my life," or "I feel like I missed something important." They didn't miss it, they lost it. And somewhere close by, another version of them is living with what they didn't choose. The question that now emerges is not whether this is happening, it's how often. And whether you've already experienced the aftershocks without realizing what they were. Because if timelines can remain close, if choices don't always separate them cleanly, then some moments in your life may not belong entirely to this version of you. And the deeper we go, the harder it becomes to tell where one life ends and another almost began. Why do some decisions feel heavier before you ever understand why? Why does your body tense, your breathing change, your thoughts scatter, even when logic insists the choice is simple? What if that weight is not fear of consequence, but awareness of scale? By the time a choice reaches your conscious mind, something much older has already begun calculating. Long before language forms, before reasons line up, your nervous system reacts. Heart rate shifts, muscles tighten, attention narrows. This is not psychology alone. It is physics playing out inside biology. You are not just deciding. You are approaching a region of extreme density in the structure of your future. In reality, decisions are not points. They are fields. Volumes of possibility compressed into moments that feel impossibly small. Most choices are light. They barely bend the flow of your life. Eat this or that. Leave now or later. These choices branch, but their branches run nearly parallel, close enough to remain stable. But some decisions sit at rare coordinates, places where many long-term futures intersect. These are not random. They appear when identity, environment, timing, and probability align. Physics would call them critical points. Systems near critical points behave strangely. Small inputs create disproportionate effects. A whisper can become an avalanche. This is why one sentence can end a relationship. One delay can change a career. One hesitation can save a life. The size of the input does not predict the size of the outcome. What matters is where the system is when the input occurs. Decision gravity is the name we give to this phenomenon. Not metaphorical gravity, but something structurally similar. Just as mass bends space-time, high-density future states bend experience. They pull attention toward them. They slow perception. They make the moment feel significant before you know why. You've felt this, standing on the edge of a choice and thinking, why does this feel so serious? The answer is not that you are anxious. The answer is that the future is crowded here. At these points, timelines do not gently branch. They collide. Many viable versions of you converge on a narrow gateway, each demanding continuity. Physics does not prefer one over the other. It prefers stability. And stability requires resolution. This is why hesitation feels painful. Not because you are weak, but because the system is overloaded. Too many futures remain active. Reality is paying an energetic cost to keep them open. Your body feels that cost as tension. People often confuse this with intuition, telling them what to choose. But intuition is not a voice. It is pressure, a sense of pull or resistance that exists before reasons. It does not say, "This is right." It says, "This matters." And mattering is dangerous. Because the more a choice matters, the more futures it collapses. Think about the moments in your life that permanently altered your trajectory. Leaving a place, choosing a person, saying yes when you almost said no. Those moments didn't feel neutral at the time. They felt charged, as if the air itself had weight, as if something was waiting. That feeling was accurate. At high-gravity decision points, time behaves differently. Seconds stretch, memory sharpens, details burn themselves into awareness. This is not because the moment is dramatic. It is because the system is unstable. Near critical thresholds, even small fluctuations become noticeable. Consciousness zooms in because the margin for error has narrowed. And here is the unsettling truth. The gravity you feel before a choice is proportional not to risk, but to divergence. How far apart the resulting lives will be. Some choices create futures that remain close. Same city, same people, same self, slightly altered. Others tear you away from entire identity structures. They separate you from versions of yourself that can never converge again. Those choices feel like standing at the edge of something irreversible, because they are. And irreversibility leaves marks. This explains why people often delay the most important decisions of their lives. Not because they don't know what to do, but because something in them knows the cost. To choose is to amputate. To decide is to destroy continuity with other selves. So the mind invents reasons to wait, to gather more information, to feel ready. But readiness is a myth. No one is ever ready to lose infinite futures. You move forward not because you are prepared, but because the pressure becomes unbearable. And sometimes, you don't move at all. This is where things grow darker. When a decision point remains unresolved too long, the system doesn't freeze. It degrades. Futures begin to interfere destructively. Anxiety increases. Confusion spreads. Motivation collapses. People describe this as feeling stuck, lost, or fragmented. In physics, this would be called decoherence without collapse, a state where possibilities lose alignment but none fully resolve. It feels awful. You are pulled in multiple directions, but none lead anywhere. Energy drains, identity blurs. This is why chronic indecision corrodes the self. Not because of stress, but because the system is trying to maintain incompatible futures simultaneously. Eventually, something forces resolution. An external event, a breakdown, a loss, or a moment of reckless clarity. Collapse happens whether you choose or not. The universe does not allow indefinite ambiguity, but here's what most people never realize. The stronger the decision gravity, the more likely the resulting timelines remain close after collapse. Massive choices often produce futures that diverge emotionally more than structurally. The external life may look similar. Same job, same partner, same body, but the internal configuration shifts profoundly. This is why people wake up years later feeling estranged from their own lives. Everything appears correct, yet something feels wrong, as if they are living the aftermath of a decision they don't fully remember making. They are. Because in some nearby timeline, they chose differently, and the distance between those lives is small enough for echoes to travel. This is not mystical thinking. In complex systems, nearby states influence each other through shared boundaries. In physics, this happens in phase space. In human experience, it happens through emotion, intuition, and memory distortions. This is why regret can feel specific even when you can't name what you regret. Why nostalgia can ache for things you never had. Why you feel pulled toward paths that logic insists are closed. You are sensing the gravitational shadow of another outcome. And here is the most uncomfortable realization of all. Decision gravity works in both directions. Not only do future outcomes pull on the present can pull futures back toward itself. Timelines are not rigid rails. They curve. They drift. Under certain conditions, they can approach each other again. especially when the divergence was emotional rather than structural. This means that some choices are not final in the way you think, not because you can undo them, but because their consequences may reappear in altered form. People re-enter your life, opportunities resurface, patterns repeat with uncanny precision. These are not second chances in a moral sense. They are convergence attempts, reality trying to reconcile nearby timelines that never fully separated. And convergence is risky. When timelines approach, inconsistencies arise, conflicting memories, emotional dissonance, a sense that time is looping or stuttering. This is when people feel like life is scripted, like events are repeating with variations, like they have been here before. They have. Not in this exact form, but close enough. Decision gravity does not end when you choose. It reshapes the terrain around you for years afterward. It determines which futures remain reachable, which identities remain coherent, and which memories feel stable. And once you recognize it, you can't unsee it. Every moment of hesitation, every inexplicable pull, every heavy silence before action becomes a signal, not telling you what to do, but revealing how much is at stake. Because the universe does not whisper at decision points. It leans in. And as we move forward, the next question becomes unavoidable. If choices carry gravity, if timelines remain close, if futures can interfere, then what happens when those futures begin to bleed through? Have you ever felt nostalgia for a place you've never been? Have you ever woken from a dream carrying grief so precise it felt borrowed, as if you were missing someone who never existed in your waking life? What if those sensations are not imagination, but overlap? If timelines diverged cleanly, if choices truly sealed futures apart forever, the story would end with collapse. One life chosen, others gone, silence. But reality is rarely that tidy. Nature dislikes sharp borders. Everywhere you look, boundaries blur, heat diffuses, particles tunnel, signals leak, and when systems grow complex enough, separation becomes temporary. Timelines are no exception. When two possible lives diverge only slightly, same body, same environment, same era, they do not immediately lose coherence. They drift like parallel currents in deep water, distinct but close enough to feel each other's wake. Most of the time, the barrier holds, but under the right conditions, information seeps through. This is the echo effect, not memories crossing intact. That would be too obvious, too destabilizing. What crosses instead is something rawer, emotional residue, unfinished intent, the afterimage of a path not taken. In physics, interference occurs when waves overlap before fully separating. The result is distortion. Peaks intensify, troughs cancel, patterns emerge that do not belong to either wave alone. In human experience, interference looks like déjà vu, sudden certainty, inexplicable fear, or attraction with no origin story. You recognize a moment before it happens. You dread an outcome before it exists. You feel relief for a disaster that never occurs. These are not predictions. They are reverberations. Think about déjà vu. Not the casual kind, the unsettling kind, the kind that stops you mid-sentence because you know what will happen next. The furniture feels positioned correctly. The lighting feels familiar. Your body reacts before your thoughts catch up. For a split second, reality feels duplicated, like a misaligned frame in a film reel. That sensation is wrong because it violates narrative time. Memory is supposed to trail experience. Déjà vu flips the order. It suggests recall without precedent. This is why it disturbs people, because the mind knows something impossible just occurred. Neurology tries to explain this as a timing error, a glitch in memory encoding. But that explanation only describes the mechanism, not the source. Why does the brain misfire at specific moments, often near decisions, emotional thresholds, or life transitions? Why not randomly, constantly? Because the brain is not inventing the signal. It is receiving one it cannot fully process. Echoes appear most strongly near convergence zones, places where timelines remain structurally similar long after a choice. The closer the lives, the stronger the bleed. The further they diverge, the quieter the signal. This is why certain alternate lives haunt you more than others. You don't grieve the version of you who moved to another continent and became someone unrecognizable. That life is too far away, too incoherent. But the version of you who stayed but chose differently, loved differently, spoke when you stayed silent, that life runs parallel to yours, close enough to whisper. And whispers are harder to ignore than silence. Echoes don't announce themselves as information. They arrive disguised as emotion. A sudden sadness with no cause, a joy that feels premature, a pull toward a person, place, or idea that logic can't justify. Your conscious mind scrambles for explanations, but none quite fit. So you tell yourself stories. You say you're just nostalgic. You say you're anxious. You say you're bored. You say you're romanticizing the past. But what you're actually feeling is pressure from an adjacent outcome. This is especially noticeable after life-altering decisions. People often report that the months following a major choice feel unreal, dreamlike, or hollow. They're not depressed. They're not lost. They're adjusting to a sudden reduction in dimensionality. Many futures went quiet at once. The noise stopped, and the silence feels unnatural. That silence is temporary. As time passes, the surviving timeline stabilizes. Memory rewrites itself to support coherence. Your story becomes cleaner. Justifications form. Regret dulls. The mind does this not to comfort you, but to protect reality from contradiction. But stabilization is not perfect. Some echoes remain embedded, like artifacts left behind after a merge that didn't fully complete. They surface during sleep, during moments of vulnerability, during creative flow, during grief. That's why dreams often feel like lives in progress. Not symbolic nonsense, but as coherent narratives with emotional continuity. You wake from them disoriented because they don't feel imagined. They feel lived, and sometimes they feel unfinished. This is where the idea of merging becomes unavoidable. If timelines can drift, if they can remain close, then under certain conditions they can approach again. Not fully recombine, that would shatter identity, but partially overlap. Enough to exchange impressions. Enough to blur edges. Merges don't look like sci-fi. There is no flash of light. No sudden knowledge download. A merge feels like misalignment, like something in your life suddenly fits better, or worse, without explanation. Like you gained or lost interest overnight. Like a relationship subtly changes tone without a cause. People describe this as, I woke up different, or something shifted, or I don't know why, but I can't go back to how I felt before. They assume it's personal growth, or trauma, or aging. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. Sometimes it's the residue of two similar lives brushing past each other and exchanging weight. This explains why some emotional reactions feel disproportionate, why a small event hits like a catastrophe, why a trivial loss feels unbearable. You are not reacting only to what happened here. You are carrying the emotional load of something that ended elsewhere, and because you cannot remember it, the emotion has nowhere to go. So it lingers. This also explains the opposite phenomenon. Sudden, unearned confidence, a sense of certainty that arrives without experience, skills that appear quickly, insights that feel remembered rather than learned. You don't know where they came from, but they work. You didn't invent them. You inherited them from a nearby version of yourself that already paid the cost. This is why some people feel older than their years, why others feel displaced in time, why some people mourn lives they never lived, while others feel strangely complete despite lack of experience. They are not anomalies, they are artifacts. The universe does not discard viable information lightly. When futures collapse, their data does not vanish, it disperses. Most of it becomes noise, but some fragments embed themselves in the only structure complex enough to hold them: consciousness. And consciousness, overwhelmed with contradiction, does what it always does. It tells a story that feels true enough to survive, but beneath that story, echoes remain. They shape your fears. They guide your attractions. They influence your sense of meaning. And once you recognize them, you begin to see your life differently. Not as a single path, but as a survivor of many, which leads to a dangerous realization. If echoes exist, if memories are not proof, if emotion can cross between lives, then what you remember may not be the whole truth, and what you've forgotten may still be shaping you. How much of your life do you actually remember? And how much of it has been edited so you can continue? Memory feels solid because it has to. If it weren't, identity would fracture every morning. You wake up believing the past is stable, that events line up behind you like stones marking a single trail. But memory was never designed to record reality. It was designed to preserve coherence, to make one version of events feel inevitable enough that you can move forward without collapsing under contradiction. In physics, memory is not storage, it is reconstruction. Every time you recall something, you rebuild it from fragments, emotions, and expectation. The past is not retrieved, it is regenerated. And regeneration always favors consistency over accuracy. Now place that inside a universe where multiple futures once existed. If parallel timelines collapse, drift, and sometimes brush against each other, then memory becomes a gatekeeper. Its job is no longer just to remember, it is to filter, to discard information that does not belong to the surviving configuration, to smooth over discontinuities, to protect the story of this life from contamination. This is why memory feels unreliable around major decisions. Ask someone about the moment their life changed and watch what happens. The details blur. Time compresses. They remember how it felt, but not exactly what was said. They recall the outcome, but not the internal debate. It's not because the moment was insignificant. It's because too much was happening. At points of high divergence, memory cannot afford to be precise. Precision would expose alternatives. This explains something subtle and disturbing. Why certain memories feel emotionally charged but visually vague. Why you can feel the weight of a moment without seeing it clearly. The emotion survived because it belonged to multiple nearby futures. The details were pruned because they did not. Memory keeps what stabilizes identity and discards what threatens it. Think about the memories that haunt you most. They are rarely complete scenes. They are fragments, a look, a tone, a sentence without context. They return because they are unresolved, not morally, but structurally. They point to something that did not fully collapse, something that still exists nearby. And then there are the memories you don't question at all. The ones that feel obvious, clean, unquestionable. Those are the most dangerous ones, because they are often the most edited, polished into place so well that you never suspect they could have gone another way. Memory is not evidence, it is a survival mechanism. This becomes terrifying when you consider how often memory rewrites itself after a life-altering choice. People swear they always knew they would end up where they are, that they were meant to choose what they chose. This belief emerges after the fact, not before. It is the mind sealing the branch behind itself, reinforcing the illusion that no other path was viable. But if that were true, why does doubt linger? Why does the mind occasionally drift toward alternatives with such intensity that it hurts? Why do what-if thoughts arrive uninvited, vivid, emotionally precise, as if they belong to a real history rather than imagination? Because they do. They belong to a history that was valid until it wasn't. Memory suppresses those histories not because they're false, but because they're incompatible. Holding them clearly would destabilize the narrative of this life. You would feel divided, you would hesitate, you would struggle to act. So the mind does what reality itself does at a collapse point. It sacrifices information to preserve function, but sacrifice leaves scars. This is why people sometimes experience false nostalgia, a longing for a time or place that never existed, or a strange grief for a version of themselves they can't quite describe. This is not romantic fantasy. It is grief without an object, mourning without a funeral. Your mind remembers something ended. It just can't remember what. This also explains why memory is weakest around moments of convergence. When timelines drift close again, when echoes intensify, memory becomes unstable. People report feeling disoriented, time-blind, emotionally raw. They forget words, lose track of days, feel like events are happening too fast or too slow. They assume they are stressed. They are not wrong, but they are incomplete. Stress is what it feels like when the system struggles to maintain a single coherent history under conflicting input. When echoes from nearby outcomes introduce noise. When the past tries to reorganize itself around a present that doesn't quite fit. This is why memory can suddenly reframe itself years later. A moment you dismissed as insignificant suddenly feels monumental. A relationship you thought you understood reveals a new emotional dimension. A choice you never questioned begins to ache. It's not that the past changed. Your position relative to other possible pasts did. As you move forward in time, the distance between timelines can shrink or widen. Some futures drift away and go silent. Others curve back toward you. When one approaches, its emotional weight becomes audible. Memory adjusts, searching for a place to anchor the signal. Sometimes it finds one, sometimes it doesn't. When it doesn't, you feel restless, unsettled, as if something is missing from your story. This is why people often feel compelled to return to old places, revisit old conversations, reconnect with people they left behind. They say they want closure. What they are actually seeking is alignment, a way to reconcile the version of themselves that exists now with the versions that almost survived. And sometimes reconciliation is possible, not by undoing choices, but by integrating their emotional residue. Other times, it isn't, because some futures were too divergent, too incompatible. Their echoes cannot be absorbed without destabilizing identity. So, the mind rejects them, labels them fantasy, buries them under logic, calls them dreams. But rejection does not erase pressure. It redirects it into anxiety, into numbness, into longing, into the feeling that life is happening slightly off-center. This brings us to a realization that quietly terrifies most people once they glimpse it. If memory is curated, if emotion can leak across timelines, if identity is stabilized by forgetting, then the version of you that feels real may not be the original. It may simply be the one that held together. And if that is true, then the cost of choosing was never just about what you gained. It was about what you had to forget to survive. In the next segment, we confront that cost directly. Not as philosophy, but as something you have likely already felt, without knowing what it was. What does it cost to become one version of yourself? Not metaphorically, not emotionally, structurally. Every decision that matters forces a reduction. Out of many viable lives, only one continues with full continuity. The rest do not end in fire or silence. They end in disconnection. And disconnection is not free. You pay for it slowly, in ways that don't announce themselves. People expect the cost of a choice to arrive as consequences, success or failure, reward or regret. But that's only the surface layer. Beneath it lies a quieter toll, a subtraction so subtle you don't notice it happening. You just feel lighter in the wrong way, as if something important was removed without your consent. This is why even right choices can feel heavy long after they're made. You finally leave. You finally commit. You finally change. And instead of relief, there's a strange grief that creeps in weeks or months later. You tell yourself you're just adjusting, that this is normal, that growth hurts. Sometimes that's true. Sometimes it isn't. Sometimes what you're feeling is the absence of futures that were fully real until the moment you stepped forward. Futures that contain skills you never learned, people you never met, versions of yourself that would have endured things you never had to face. Those versions did not die. They were cut off. And cutting off viable futures creates what physics would call informational debt. In physical systems, when information is destroyed or made inaccessible, energy must be expended. There is always a cost. In human systems, that cost appears as emotional residue, unaccounted for sadness, sudden emptiness, a sense that something meaningful ended even though nothing visibly did. This is why people sometimes grieve after success. They get what they wanted, and something inside them goes quiet. The noise of possibility vanishes. The future becomes narrower, more defined, safer, and smaller. They mistake this feeling for dissatisfaction. But it's not dissatisfaction with what they chose. It's mourning for what they had to let go of in order to choose it all. You were never meant to carry infinite versions of yourself forward. Consciousness cannot support that kind of load, so reality forces simplification. And simplification, by definition, involves loss. But here's the part that destabilizes people once they sense it. You don't just lose futures when you choose. You lose capacities. Each unrealized life carried adaptations, emotional strengths, ways of seeing, tolerances for pain. Some of those were never developed in this timeline because the conditions that would have shaped them never occurred. This is why some people feel strangely fragile despite living relatively stable lives, and why others feel unreasonably resilient after chaos. They didn't just live through different events, they emerged from different pruning processes. The universe did not choose the strongest version of you. It chose the version that remained coherent. And coherence is not the same as optimal. This explains something deeply uncomfortable: why people sometimes feel outmatched by life despite doing everything right. They didn't fail. They simply survived a collapse that favored stability over robustness. Nearby versions of them endured harsher paths and emerged hardened, but those paths diverged too far to converge cleanly. Those versions exist. They just don't get to help you directly. So instead, you feel their absence as inadequacy, and that absence can manifest as self-doubt, imposter syndrome, or the sense that you are missing some essential trait everyone else seems to have. You assume it's personal, a flaw. It isn't. It's structural loss. The cost becomes even heavier when the choice involved another person. Relationships are powerful convergence engines. Two lives aligning amplify divergence when they separate. When you choose someone, or choose not to, you are not just selecting a partner, you are collapsing entire relational universes. Futures where you grew old together, futures where you hurt each other, futures where you learned lessons this timeline never demanded. Ending or committing to a relationship doesn't just affect what happens next. It deletes emotional architectures that were in the process of forming. That deletion leaves behind ghost feelings. This is why people sometimes feel heartbreak without a breakup, or feel emotionally tethered to someone long after logic insists they should have moved on, or feel sudden waves of sadness when thinking about someone they barely knew. They are not mourning the person. They are mourning a shared future that was viable and then pruned. And here is where the cost becomes cumulative. Every major choice reduces the dimensionality of your life. Not in a bad way, just in a real one. Your future becomes more defined, more constrained, more specific. You gain depth, but you lose breadth. Possibility is exchanged for continuity. This is why youth feels expansive and aging feels narrowing. Not because time is running out, but because more collapses have occurred. More futures have been sealed away. More paths are no longer reachable without tearing the structure of your life apart. People feel this narrowing as fear of change, as resistance, as a sense that it's too late. They assume it's psychological. It's not entirely. It's structural inertia. The more collapses you survive, the harder it becomes to generate clean divergence. New choices must overcome the weight of existing commitments. The system resists dramatic shifts because too much would have to be rewritten. This is why midlife transitions feel dangerous. Not emotionally, existentially. They threaten to reopen branches that have already been sealed, and reopening them destabilizes memory, identity, and meaning. Some people attempt it anyway. They chase lost futures, try to recover versions of themselves they once glimpsed. Sometimes it works. Often it doesn't, because the system has moved on. The distance between timelines has grown too large. When it fails, the result is not liberation. It's fragmentation. People feel split, unanchored, as if they don't fully belong anywhere. They are trying to inhabit two incompatible futures at once, and reality does not allow that for long. This is why the cost of choosing is not paid all at once. It accrues. Small losses stack. Unlived lives pile up behind you. Most remain silent, but some press forward, demanding acknowledgement. This is when people feel existential weight, not sadness, not despair, weight, as if their life carries more gravity than it should. They say things like, "I don't know why, but everything feels heavier lately," or "I feel tired in a way sleep doesn't fix." They are not tired of living. They are tired of carrying the aftermath of many collapses, and yet, this is not a warning against choosing. It is the opposite. Avoiding choice does not preserve futures, it rots them. Unresolved possibilities decay into anxiety and paralysis. They don't remain beautiful and intact. They become toxic. The cost of choosing is grief. The cost of not choosing is erosion. Both are painful, but only one leads somewhere. The danger is not that you lose futures when you choose. The danger is that you forget they were ever real, because forgotten loss turns inward. It becomes self-criticism, restlessness, the sense that something is wrong with you rather than something ended. In the next segment, we approach the rare moments when reality attempts to correct this imbalance. Moments when timelines that diverge too close begin to bend back toward each other. Not gently, but with force. There are moments in life that feel impossible to explain. Meetings that happen too late to be coincidence, yet too early to be chance. Events that arrive with the precision of intention, as if reality itself adjusted its timing to place something directly in your path. People call these moments fate, or luck, or synchronicity. But those words are just labels for something deeper and far more unsettling. They are convergence events. After timelines diverge, most drift apart and fade into silence. But some never gain enough distance. Their structures remain similar. Their emotional trajectories continue to mirror each other. And when that happens, reality does something rare. It tries to reconcile. Convergence is not kindness, it is correction. In physics, systems that evolve along similar paths tend to interact again if no strong barrier separates them. Trajectories bend. Probabilities cluster. What looks impossible from the inside appears inevitable from above. The universe is not guiding you toward meaning. It is minimizing instability. And instability increases when nearby timelines remain unresolved. This is why certain patterns repeat in your life with uncanny accuracy. You meet the same kind of person in different bodies. You face the same choice in different settings. You keep arriving at the same emotional crossroads, no matter how far you think you've traveled. You assume you didn't learn the lesson. That's not always true. Sometimes, the lesson belongs to another version of you, one whose timeline remained close enough that its unresolved momentum keeps pulling reality back into alignment. Convergence events feel scripted because they are structurally driven. When two nearby futures remain viable but incompatible, the system attempts reconciliation by recreating conditions where divergence first occurred. It gives the unresolved pattern another chance to resolve cleanly. This is why second chances feel heavier than first ones. The stakes are higher, the familiarity is unsettling, the pressure is immense. You sense that something fundamental is being tested, not just behavior, but identity. If you choose differently this time, the system stabilizes. If you don't, divergence sharpens and the timelines finally separate. People often describe these moments as crossroads, but crossroads are passive. You choose a direction and leave the others behind. Convergence events are not crossroads, they are collisions. You feel this collision as emotional intensity without clear cause, a relationship that escalates too quickly, a decision that feels rushed by circumstances, a situation that forces action before you feel ready. You tell yourself it's bad timing. It's not. It's compression. Reality is folding two trajectories into a single moment and demanding resolution. The longer it waits, the more unstable the system becomes. So, events accelerate. Coincidences stack. Pressure mounts. This is why convergence often arrives during periods of exhaustion, grief, or transition. When your defenses are low. When your narrative grip on reality loosens. The system exploits vulnerability because it allows reconfiguration with less resistance. That's why these moments feel overwhelming. Not because they are harmful, but because they threaten coherence. If the merge succeeds too forcefully, identity can fracture, memory can destabilize, emotion can flood. This is when people say, "I don't recognize myself anymore," or "everything changed so fast," or "it feels like my life split in two." They're not wrong. Something did split, and something else tried to recombine. Not all convergence events succeed. Sometimes the system aborts the merge. The pressure becomes too high, contradictions too severe. When that happens, the timelines finally diverge cleanly, and the opportunity disappears. People feel this as sudden loss, a connection that vanishes overnight, an opportunity that collapses without explanation, a sense that something almost happened but didn't. These losses hurt more than ordinary ones because they are not just endings, they are failed reconciliations. Your system sensed that something unresolved was about to be integrated, and then it wasn't. The emotional charge remains without resolution. The echo intensifies rather than fading. This is why certain missed chances haunt people far more than outright failures. Failure closes a path. A failed convergence leaves it half open, vibrating. And sometimes, convergence succeeds, but imperfectly. This is the most dangerous outcome. When two timelines partially merge, they do not blend seamlessly. They overlap. You inherit emotional weight from one path and circumstances from another. You feel misaligned, restless, as if you're living a life that almost fits but not entirely. People call this a midlife crisis, or burnout, or identity confusion. But at its core, It is misalignment after partial convergence. The system tried to reconcile futures that should have separated, and now you are carrying incompatible instructions, desires that don't match circumstances, capabilities that don't align with opportunity. This is when people feel deeply out of place in their own lives. They don't want to escape. They want to realign. And here's the most unsettling truth of convergence. Awareness changes the outcome. The moment you recognize a convergence event for what it is, you alter its trajectory. Observation reintroduces instability. The system must adapt. Some opportunities vanish. Others deepen. This is why certain moments feel fragile once you notice them. Like naming them might break them. Because in a sense, it does. Convergence requires unconscious participation. Too much analysis disrupts the process. Too little awareness allows it to overwhelm you. Balance is rare, which is why convergence events are rare. But when they happen, they matter more than almost anything else in your life. They are not about success or failure. They are about coherence. Whether the version of you that survives is one you can inhabit without tearing yourself apart. As we move forward, the question sharpens. What happens to those who never fully align with the timeline they're in? What happens to people who survive a merge, but not the life that fits them? In the next segment, we explore the quiet dislocation that follows imperfect convergence, the feeling of being a stranger inside your own existence. There is a particular kind of loneliness that has nothing to do with people. You can be surrounded, supported, even loved, and still feel like you don't belong in your own life. Not lost, not broken, just misplaced. This feeling doesn't arrive loudly. It settles in slowly, like dust in a room you stopped entering. You go through the motions. You meet expectations. You perform competence. But somewhere beneath all of it is the quiet sense that you are slightly out of phase with everything around you, as if you arrived here by mistake. Most people interpret this as dissatisfaction, or boredom, or a failure of gratitude. They tell themselves they should be happier, that something must be wrong with them for feeling this way when, objectively, things are fine. But what if nothing is wrong with you? What if you are experiencing the aftershock of a life that almost aligned, but didn't? When convergence events fail to resolve cleanly, they don't always explode into crisis. More often, they leave behind subtle dislocation. You survive the merge, but not into the version of reality best suited for you. The system stabilized, but not optimally. You are coherent, but you are not aligned. This is what displacement feels like. In physics, when a system is forced into a stable configuration that is not its lowest energy state, it remains intact, but tense. Energy builds internally. Small disturbances feel exhausting. Minor conflicts feel overwhelming. Nothing is technically wrong, yet everything feels harder than it should. This is how people become tired of lives they never chose. You feel it when effort outweighs meaning, when motivation evaporates without explanation, when rest doesn't restore you, when you look ahead and feel no excitement, only maintenance. People call this burnout. But burnout implies overuse. This is not overuse. This is misfit. You are using the wrong configuration for the energy you carry. And that energy didn't come from nowhere. It came from futures that prepared you for a different life. A version of you survived challenges this timeline never demanded. Another version learned lessons you never needed here. A third endured losses that hardened them in ways you never had to become. Those capacities exist, but they have no outlet, so they turn inward. This is why displaced people often feel simultaneously capable and useless. They sense depth that they cannot apply, strength they cannot use, insight that finds no traction. They are overqualified for their own lives, and it hurts in a way that is hard to explain. This is also why displaced people often feel drawn to intensity, to danger, to chaos, to dramatic change. Not because they are reckless, but because intensity creates conditions closer to the timelines they almost inhabited. It feels familiar, grounding, real. Calm, stable lives feel wrong to them. Not because they dislike peace, but because peace arrived without the preparation their system expects. So they self-sabotage, or fantasize about escape, or romanticize catastrophe. They don't want destruction, they want alignment. They want a life that matches their internal weight. This dislocation also affects relationships. Displaced people often struggle to feel fully seen, Not because others fail to see them, but because the version being seen doesn't feel complete. They sense that some essential part of themselves is missing from the interaction. That conversations skim the surface of something much deeper that never quite enters the room. They feel lonely even when understood, and this leads to a particularly cruel form of self-doubt. They assume they are broken, that they lack presence, that they are emotionally unavailable, that they can't commit. But what they are actually experiencing is grief for a self that didn't survive, a self that would have fit better here, or fit here at all. This grief has no language, no ritual, no acknowledgement. Society does not recognize mourning for unlived lives, so the grief turns inward and becomes identity confusion. People say things like, "I don't know who I am anymore." What they mean is, I don't know which version of me is supposed to be here. The most unsettling part is this. Displacement can persist even after success. You can fix your life externally and still feel wrong internally. New jobs, new cities, new relationships don't solve it because the misalignment is not situational, it is structural. You are trying to adjust the environment to match an internal configuration that belongs to another branch. Sometimes, displacement fades with time. As the distance between timelines increases, echoes weaken. The internal tension softens. You grow into the life you have, sometimes. Other times, it doesn't. And when it doesn't, the system attempts correction again. Another convergence event, another opportunity, another disruption, another moment that feels strangely familiar and unbearably heavy. This is why certain people experience repeated upheavals, not because they are unlucky, but because the system keeps trying to realign them with a life that fits, each attempt more forceful than the last. And eventually, the pressure becomes impossible to ignore. People reach a breaking point. They don't say, "I want more." They say, "I can't keep living like this." That sentence is not about desire. It is about coherence. They are not chasing happiness. They are trying to stop the internal tearing. This is where the narrative often turns dramatic. Career changes, abrupt endings, radical moves. People around them are shocked. "Why now?" they ask. Everything was fine. It wasn't. It was stable. And stability without alignment is a slow erosion. But here is the part that matters most. Displacement is not a curse. It is information. It is the signal that your current trajectory is not the only one still influencing you, that nearby futures remain close enough to exert pressure, that something in you has not yet been integrated. Displacement does not mean you chose wrong. It means the choice did not finish resolving, and unresolved systems do not stay quiet forever. In the next segment, we approach the moment when awareness itself becomes the final variable, when recognizing the pattern changes the outcome, when the last major choice stops being external and becomes internal. Because the most dangerous decision you will ever make is not about where you go or what you do. It is about which version of yourself you allow to remain. There comes a moment when the pressure stops coming from the outside. No new crisis, no dramatic event, no obvious fork in the road. Instead, something quieter happens. You become aware, not intellectually, not as an idea you can debate, but as a shift in how the present feels. Time seems thinner, choices feel closer. The distance between thought and consequence shortens. You notice yourself noticing. This is the final convergent zone. Up until now, the system has been adjusting around you, nudging events, repeating patterns, offering second chances disguised as coincidences. But once awareness enters the equation, the rules change. Because awareness is not passive, it is an interaction, and interaction collapses possibilities. This is the moment most people miss. They think the important choices are external: the job, the relationship, the move, the risk. They wait for the world to present a dramatic option. But by the time awareness arrives, those choices are already secondary. The real decision is internal. It is the decision about which version of yourself you will authorize to continue. For most of your life, identity feels inherited. You are who you are because of what happened to you, because of what you chose, because of what you survived. But that story only works when you are unaware of alternatives. Once you sense the pressure of nearby lives, identity stops feeling fixed. It feels negotiable, dangerously so. You begin to notice how often you act out of habit rather than alignment. How many reactions belong to an older configuration of you? How many fears are leftovers from futures that never happened? How many desires feel borrowed rather than chosen? This is not self-improvement territory. This is existential territory, because the moment you see that identity is not singular, you are forced to confront a terrifying freedom. You are no longer just reacting to your life. You are selecting which internal architecture gets to drive it. And selection is irreversible. Up to this point, unresolved futures could still exert pressure. Echoes could still bleed through, but once you consciously integrate awareness of them, they lose leverage, not because they disappear, but because they are acknowledged. Unacknowledged futures haunt. Acknowledged futures integrate or dissolve. This is why awareness feels dangerous. People sense that if they really look at their patterns, something will change that cannot be undone. They fear losing themselves. But what they are actually afraid of is losing a version of themselves that is no longer sustainable. The system senses this too. This is why awareness often arrives during moments of stillness, during exhaustion, during silence, when distractions fall away, when the mind can no longer maintain its narrative defenses. The universe does not shout this moment into existence. It waits for you to be quiet enough to hear it. And when you do, the pressure intensifies. You begin to feel time accelerating, not because life is moving faster, but because fewer futures remain open. The window is narrowing. The system is preparing to lock in a configuration. This is why people say things like, "I feel like something is about to happen," or "I can't keep avoiding this," or "I need to decide who I am." They are not anticipating an event. They are approaching identity collapse. But this collapse is different. It is not forced by circumstance. It is chosen by alignment. You stop asking, "What should I do?" and start asking, "Which version of me is real enough to keep?" This question is not answered with logic. It is answered with commitment. Commitment is the most powerful force in a branching system, stronger than fear, stronger than desire, stronger even than probability. Commitment signals to the system that ambiguity is no longer allowed, that the configuration must stabilize around a chosen internal state. This is why half choices feel draining. They keep futures alive without feeding any of them. This is why clarity brings energy even when the path is difficult, because the system no longer has to support contradiction. But here is the paradox. You cannot commit to a future. You can only commit to a version of yourself. Futures are unstable, circumstances change, people leave, bodies fail, plans dissolve. But identity, once aligned, can survive all of that. It becomes the through line that makes experience coherent. This is why people who seem at peace are not those with perfect lives. They are those whose internal configuration matches the life they are in. Their energy flows without resistance. Their actions feel inevitable rather than forced. They are not lucky. They are aligned. And alignment does something profound. It quiets echoes. Not by erasing other lives, but by honoring them. By recognizing that they were valid, and that their purpose was not to be lived, but to inform the one that remains. Once acknowledged, they stop pulling. They release their grip. This is why some people experience a sudden calm after deep realization. Not joy, not excitement, calm. As if something finally settled. As if the internal noise faded, the system stabilized. But stabilization does not mean stagnation. It means coherence. And coherence opens a new phase of existence. Because once the internal choice is made, external choices change character. They stop feeling existential. They become expressive. You are no longer choosing to become someone. You are choosing how to express who you already are. This is the moment where many people mistakenly believe the story is over. It isn't. Because coherence does not protect you from reality. It prepares you to face it. In the final segment, we confront what it means to live as the timeline that remains, not as the best version, not as the happiest one, but as the one that is fully inhabited, the one that no longer runs from its own gravity. At some point, the noise fades, not because life becomes easier, not because uncertainty disappears, but because the struggle between versions finally ends. You feel it as a strange stillness, not peace in the comforting sense, but firmness. Like standing on ground that no longer shifts beneath your feet. The world is still unpredictable, still sharp, still capable of loss. But you are no longer divided about being here. This is what it means to become the timeline that remains. Not the best timeline, not the happiest, not the one free from pain, the inhabited one. For most of your life, you were partially elsewhere, Some of your attention lived in futures that never happened. Some of your emotion was invested in versions of yourself that didn't survive. Some of your energy was spent negotiating with ghosts, trying to justify choices, repair imagined mistakes, or keep doors open that reality had already closed. That fragmentation was not a failure. It was a transition. Every collapse leaves debris, every merge leaves tension. It takes time for a system to settle after carrying so many contradictions. What you felt as confusion, longing, or restlessness was not weakness. It was reconfiguration. Now, something different begins. When you fully inhabit a timeline, regret changes shape. It no longer asks, "What if?" It asks, "What now?" The past stops pulling you backward and starts pressing you forward, not as nostalgia, but as gravity. Everything you lived, everything you almost lived, compresses into presence. This is why fully inhabiting a life can feel heavier than drifting between possibilities. There is no escape valve anymore, no alternate self to imagine doing better, no nearby version of you to project hope onto. This is the life that gets lived. This is the body that carries it. This is the consciousness that witnesses it. And that is terrifying. But it is also the only state in which meaning becomes real. Meaning cannot exist in superposition. It requires commitment. It requires exclusion. It requires the courage to say, "This is the life I will answer for." Not because it was inevitable, but because it is mine now. This is where people misunderstand acceptance. They think it means resignation, settling, giving up on better possibilities. It doesn't. Acceptance is not about liking the timeline you're in. It's about stopping the internal war over whether you belong in it. Once that war ends, something subtle but profound happens. Your actions gain weight. Your words land differently. Your attention stops scattering. You are no longer living as a negotiation between selves. You are living as a statement, and statements shape reality. From this point on, choices still matter, but they no longer threaten your existence. They are expressions, not fractures. You can take risks without destabilizing. You can lose things without unraveling. You can change without dissolving. Because the core configuration is stable. This is why people who are fully inhabited can face uncertainty with calm, not because they know what will happen, but because they are no longer afraid of who they will be when it does. They have stopped asking the universe for permission to exist. But here is the final, unsettling truth. Fully inhabiting a timeline does not mean other timelines disappear. They don't. They simply stop asking to be lived. Their role was never to be realized. It was to apply pressure, to shape you, to refine the version of consciousness capable of carrying this life forward. Once that shaping is complete, their influence fades, not into nothingness, but into background structure. They become the silent scaffolding beneath your sense of self. This is why people who reach this state often feel older than they are, heavier, quieter. They carry the weight of many lives distilled into one, not as memory, but as depth. And depth is not always comfortable, but it is real. From here, the universe does not stop branching. It never will. But you stop fearing the branches. You understand now that the point was never to live them all. The point was to arrive somewhere solid enough to stand, to be someone who can choose without splitting, to move forward without leaving pieces of yourself behind. This does not make life fair. It does not make it easy. It makes it coherent. And coherence is the rarest outcome in a universe built on possibility. If parallel timelines exist, and the evidence suggests they must, then your life is not proof of destiny. It is proof of survival, of selection, of endurance through collapse after collapse. You are not the only version of yourself that could have existed. You are the one that did. And the moment you fully accept that, the moment you stop listening for echoes and start listening to the present, reality stops pulling you apart. It doesn't promise happiness. It doesn't promise certainty. It offers something far stranger and far more powerful. The chance to live as the timeline that remains, not haunted by what might have been, but grounded in what is. And in a universe that never stops branching, that may be the most meaningful choice of all.